Welcome back to Rochester Living with Mark Siwiec and Corey James Moran, brought to you by Legion Homes by Mark Siwiec and Associates. This is episode 219. Mark's still not sitting across from me. He's still in Barcelona. Yes, he's in Barcelona. I heard there was a theft, Tim, our producer, Tim. Yeah. His wallet was stolen, so it's not having a great time over there. So he probably wishes he was sitting here, but he is not. Instead, we have Dr. Steve Choi, Assistant Professor of Real Estate Finance at the Saunders College of Business at RIT. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, Corey. And I think, because this snow, one of the first days of the season.
Literally,
so,
yeah.
Yeah, so he might be okay in Spain, but, hopefully he's doing well. Yeah.
It does. I will say this, though, and I woke up this morning and I've got 3 small kids. I've got a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And my 4-year-old, the joy on his face, waking up and looking out and seeing that there was snow.
Totally, yeah.
Like literally ran and woke up his mom to tell him, Mom, there's snow, which she obviously was very, very concerned by.
Right, yep.
So we have you on today because I stumbled across an article in Fortune about a paper that you co-authored, The Winner's Curse. And it's going to be a really interesting topic, obviously. With the bidding wars that we've seen here in the Rochester area, it's certainly it's certainly something on the top of everyone's mind. And you even experienced, some of your own based on what I heard from your appearance with Evan Dawson, who was on our podcast not too long ago on his Connections program. But before we get into that, we like to give just an update on where things stand in terms of real estate. Today is November 10th when we're recording this, so just to throw that out there, some of the numbers are going to be a little bit different, but we always like to break down what are the single-family active homes in Monroe County, in the 6-county region. So last week we were at 546. We're actually up a little bit right now at 556, although that is a little bit skewed because properties that have delayed negotiations due today or tomorrow are obviously going to fall off once they go under contract. 6-county region, a little bit of a bump as well. 945 last week. We're at 954 right now. And then you go to that under contract and pending number. Those are dropping. And again, this, I think, kind of is in tie with what Mark always says on the podcast, that more so January 10th is kind of like that freeze date where the market kind of goes cold until mid-January. But 1094 in Monroe County last week. We're down to 1076 right now. And then the 6-county region at 1700 down to 1682. So again, there's not much going on, basically. Mortgage rates too, pretty flat right now. How closely have you been following that? How much of that do you look into?
Yeah, so I followed the Freddie Mac 30-year fixed mortgage, week, and I think in the week of November 6th, it reached 6.22. So it's been kind of bumping around there, and everybody's trying to expect it to fall a little bit. But compared to the January level, it certainly has significantly reduced. And as the Federal Reserve cuts the rates, we expect it to sort of follow a little bit in tandem. And hopefully can give some room for the refinancing and other opportunities.
Hopefully. I feel like we're for at least for now, because we're kind of flying blind here with the government shutdown. There's not a lot of economic, there's no economic data really to go off of, and we don't know what the Fed's going to do in December. But where we're at, right now it's at 6.32. That's down from 6.33 last week. We always go to Mortgage News Daily. That's where we look at, what the average more or less is.
Right.
Not a terrible place to be. We weren't that far away from 8s, that long ago.
Agreed.
I want to get into just a little bit of background with you before we dive into the paper and your thoughts on the winner's curse. So as I mentioned, you are at RIT. Just kind of get us up to speed here. You've been in Rochester for how long?
Yeah, so this is my 3rd year at RIT.
Okay.
So in Rochester, about a little over 2 years or so. And before that, I was at Cornell, so in Ithaca, New York. So Finger Lakes plus Greater Rock area, I would say maybe about...
What drew you to Rochester?
So there were other options in terms of the job market, and had I known that the housing market was crazy, I think, because there were other heated markets in the options. But I think I like sort of the Kodak history, and I think sort of that there's a rich historical city. There's still a lot of vibrancy going on, and suburbs are a great place to raise kids, good education and great schools and hospitals. So generally, just it's easy access to everything and amenities. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, we talk about it all the time. It's a great place to live. Midwestern sensibilities. You know, we have that New York tag, but it's more probably Midwestern sensibilities.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, there's just, I don't know. I do these tours all of the time where we bring in people who are up for jobs at different companies in the area, and I just give them a quick tour of Rochester. You know, hour and a half, 2 hours. And the things that I point out for a city of our size always kind of blow people's minds. I mean, the fact that today, after this, if you wanted to go to the Eastman School of Music and go into the theater there and see some of the most beautiful architecture you've ever seen, you can do that. I mean, it's, you know, again, for a mid-sized city, not bad.
It is gorgeous. The winter before last year, we saw the Nutcracker.
Oh yeah, nice.
Yeah, yeah. So it was amazing, and just I knew the reputation of the Eastman, but it was one of those sort of incidents where we got to see the school and the buildings. So it was great. Yeah,
and it's been cool to see the evolution as well. So for a little bit of background, I went to college here. It's a while back, and that was kind of during, I would say, a little bit of a darker period, because that's when Kodak kind of fell off.
Okay, yeah.
Xerox, Bausch and Lomb, which were the big three, weren't just the power players that they used to be. And it kind of had that Rust Belt feel to it, like a lot of cities have gone through. But I would say within the last 10 years or so, there's been this really big resurgence.
Yeah.
And there's feels like there's a lot of momentum. I always kind of point back to I think it was 2016,
Yeah.
which is when Google was looking for their HQ2.
Right.
And they targeted the Finger Lakes region. We didn't end up getting it. It went to Long Island. But I think that got a lot of eyes on the region. And since then, there's been a lot of or is Amazon rather, not Google. There was a lot of eyes that have been on us, and a lot of businesses that have come since then, and certainly the bedrock of the education system that we have here, and then also the medical system too really props us up. So you've come at a good time. I will say that. I will say that.
Thanks.
So let's dive into this paper. Okay, so the winner's curse. Can you just kind of summarize basically your findings?
Yeah, so housing has a common value component. Largely, it's shared by common neighborhoods, common valuation of what that house is expected to be valued at. So when we look at in that setting where house is a commonly valued, it's possible that in the auction setting where you mentioned delayed negotiation, where people are just submitting the bids and then simultaneously opening those bids on a table at Saturday 7 p.m. That people can overbid. So there could be sense of optimism, sense of sort of, oh, I don't want to lose this bid again.
It's an emotional roller coaster. Look, I work with buyers and sellers every single day, and that is one of the things that I always prep new buyers is be prepared, because it is a very emotional process for sure.
It is, and I think imagine being in a search for a long time. You just kind of get sick of it, get fed up with it. So for all of these reasons, and it's possible also the home buyers might be first-time home buyers, so their exposure to home ownership is short, and maybe their parents didn't own the home, right? So there are a lot of limited sort of information or limited experience that governs their sort of decision making. So at the end of the day, there are two takeaway messages. One is if you are the winner in the heated bidding war, then you will overpay for compared to its intrinsic value. The second is that you're more likely to default. So
what was the percentage on that? Because was it 8?
Yeah, it's about 8% percentage point, and then you're about 2 percentage point more likely to default on your mortgage. So these are non-trivial sort of numbers, because in our sample, we look at almost 2 decades of sample across 30 states in the United States.
It's 14 million transactions.
Yeah, it's 14 million transactions. And what we find is that the holding period for an average American in this long sample is about a little over 6 years. But I would say with
it feels like it's growing, by the way.
It
is being in real estate, especially in Rochester.
It is with sort of mortgage lock-in and these situations. I think it's definitely getting
the golden handcuffs.
7 and 8, and so the longer the duration is, obviously you face more uncertainty and volatility. So the winner's curse could potentially get amplified as well. Yeah.
So for these numbers, what were the time frames? What were the years that you looked at?
Yeah, so we looked at from 2000 to 2018 to ensure that we have about 3-year worth of a window to see a repeat sale.
Yep.
But also we look at a sub period, which is the housing crash and the recovery.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
And recovery period.
Let's cover that really quick, because that was one of the follow-up questions that I had.
Yeah, sure.
How does that skew? Because again, that is not just kind of the standard that we we typically would see.
Yeah, so as one might expect, when the housing is not in boom, so when it's sort of in decay or if it's in bust, then you see less of a pronounced winner's curse. But when it's in the heated market and when the housing is a boom, then you see more pronounced winner's curse effects in these time periods. So the idea is that when everything is jolly and everybody wants to sort of go for that home and have a positive sentiment in the market, then it's more likely that when the bidding wars are more pronounced and the winter curse effects are stronger.
Right. So if you buy hot and then you sell cold, obviously it's not going to go as well.
Yeah, I think it's also because it's a cycle, right? So when you buy high, then you will have some lows. So I think that sort of also makes that cyclicality of the housing market and just generally the economy makes that winter's curse more evident through that over the years.
So it's interesting, right? Because I think this is fascinating and extremely valuable information to a market that is more balanced. And we're seeing that throughout the country. There's a lot of markets that have been a lot more balanced than the past several years. Some have actually gone into buyers markets. We talk about Florida all the time being one of them. Rochester specifically, it doesn't feel like we're there, yet. even close to it. It's just this abnormal time in real estate, at least in the Rochester market, where everything is upside down, right? Because you talk about overbidding is paying something over asking price. I mean, if you want to get into the nuance of this market, it's a really confusing one because what is even asking price is the first question, right? And like I opened up with. You've gone through this process. You've been engaged in bidding wars. What was your experience like then? Because I know, at least for my clients right now, I'm a detective every single time we're bidding on a house because I need to look into the comparable sales and not just what they sell for, but what were the list prices of those other properties, for my sellers to try to price it appropriately. And then also obviously for my buyers to know where we think it's going to go versus what that list price is. Because I would say for the past 3-4 years, I've been telling all of my buyers list price is a lie, at least in Rochester.
Yeah, I agree with that sort of anecdote, and my personal experience has been sort of congruent with that. So list price used to be an anchor, right? So kind of what you would call reservation price, so the seller would not go below that. But when seller knows that this is seller's market and there are a lot of a queuing of people outside, they could strategically even lower a little bit more so that they could lure more traction and visitors and basically bidders. In that case, I think what has anchor for many of the buyers, including myself, is sort of escalation. So you could have, say, $250K home, but you have a reasonable expectation that you might be in escalation fighting for the home $50K plus. Mm-hmm. So your realistic estimation of home is list price, plus I have to be willing to go over $50K. And in many cases, it's been 70, 80, and even 100K. Yeah. So I think the anchoring point of view has changed from listing price to being sort of seller's true reservation price, as opposed to now buyers look at the Rochester market and see that that's nowhere reasonable what I'm going to actually pay or ask the bank for the loan.
It's so interesting because we've kind of, I guess, in a way, backed ourselves into a corner as agents. Because it would be a lovely experience for everyone involved if we were able to price the properties that we're selling where we think they're actually going to sell. But there's this bizarre phenomenon that's happened in many instances when that's the strategy, where buyers are so trained at this point because for the past 5 years, they look at a list price and in their mind, they're immediately tacking on that $50K. So when you price it where you think it's going to sell, they don't even bother looking at it. And properties in many instances sell for far less than they would have if you had priced it lower to create that bidding war. This is a conversation that real estate agents have all the time. I don't necessarily know how we get back to pricing appropriately, to be honest.
Yeah, I think sort of that comes down to sort of inventory, right? The numbers that you gave, just what's the current state of the market in Rochester?
Extremely low.
Right. So we're looking at any given site you go to or platform you go to, we're looking at like 500 to 700. Where it should be, when I talk
2000.
Right, 2000. So really, you look at months of supply, it's almost less than a month or so, right? I mean, just if it were to, time on market is also tight. So, you're looking at really low inventory. So I think given that market condition, agents, brokers, there is sort of limited, their hands are tied because which property you bring to, then you have to be, if you want the sort of your buyer client to be happy and get that dream home, then you need to be realistic and provide that sort of informed guidance to them. Hey, you know what, if you don't bring cash offer, we're not going to be in the competition. If you don't bring the escalation clause, we're not going to be, if you want to do inspection, forget about it. So I think
if you're a contingent too, I mean, it's kind of nuts how it's been playing out. And when you look again specifically at the Rochester market, you brought up that inventory point. I don't see where we have any alleviation to that coming, because you look at, again, Florida, for example, the reason why it's a buyer's market is because there's a giant influx of new builds. We don't have that here. Right. And I don't foresee how that's going to even happen.
I think it's a valid point, and I think it requires a lot of coordination, the zoning and the planning and sort of builders, incentive aligning on all parts of the players. But as far as I agree with you, I think that alleviating the inventory is a really challenging issue in Rochester, because there are a lot of people who are not trying to sell it because they're locked into the sort of golden handcuffs.
Yeah.
There are not enough builders building the inventory. Also, the zoning, depending on the interpretation, some might say, hey, we need to really kind of alleviate that to make sure that we put some sort of modular homes or something like that to increase it. And the conversation is always there, but really to alleviate, we need a 2,000 plus sort of at any given time available to kind of relieve that price pressure.
And the problem is that we always get so much pushback, specifically from the towns. And it seems counterintuitive, right? Like you would want to build more houses because then more people would live in your town, and then it would bring more money to your town and vibrancy and whatnot. But there's this hesitancy for whatever it may be to really do that. And we hear these countless stories of builders that have, developments ready to roll, and they're going to these board meetings at these towns, and, the same 5 people that don't want anyone else to move there show up and shoot it down. So it's like, I don't know where we go at this point. We see a little bit of initiative from the government. Monroe County's done a little bit with some affordable housing and whatnot. But again, it's not at the scale that we can possibly achieve that's going to really move the needle.
Yeah, I think there are potentially two approaches. One is, I think sort of retail ecosystem is important. So to convince sort of the existing households to build new houses, or sort of on the sort of infill construction, in tandem with the sort of a big retail shops or even smaller ones that could generate foot traffic. I think it's a good incentive for to go as a bundle, but it's obviously different development projects.
We have, we have the buildings though. Rochester, for example, how many office buildings are, there's one floor and there's another 5 that are free right now.
Right.
And certainly that's definitely one idea that I think makes a lot of sense.
Yes. And the other one is like perhaps looking at something like independent senior living that doesn't really kind of thwart the project. So from the existing households, they might be like, oh, we don't want congestion or we want any of these. But then when you propose a plan that could, decrease the tax, right? We talked about how much of a per assessed value that tax has decreased over time because of the bigger transaction prices on properties, and on top of that, if you bring the same space type, which is residence to residence, there could be some sort of a bit of pushback in some sense. But if you say something that's like independent senior living or something a different sort of type, it could,
which makes sense too with an aging population,
right? So so I think it could cater to both demand, but also kind of stave off that tension between existing household and so forth. And sort of this is one of the conversation I also had with with the leaderships at the GRAR and all so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult. I'm not really sure. It would, again, from my perspective, we're with a lot of buyers. First time home buyers, just the affordability it's just so tough right now. Again, in an area where, you heard it moving here a few years back, it's a really affordable place to live. And by comparison to some other places, it certainly still is, but it's that kind of that mind shift, I guess. So your advice for buyers who don't, want to overpay, in a market like ours specifically, because again, if it's balanced, it's really easy, right? If asking price is true and that's what the value is, then obviously, if you have to go so much over that, then that's what you have to do. But it's a little bit more cut and dry. Again, it's very gray in this market.
Yeah, I think so. You don't want to put yourself in a house where it's not sustainable to own it, right? So it's one thing to say that I close a deal and transact it, so it's mine, as opposed to I'm able to stay there for the next 15 years or 7 years. So sustainable home ownership, I think it's a topic for everybody, both socioeconomically vulnerable, but also just general, Joe and Jane, average Joe and Jane. So the idea is that when you look at prices escalating and you're in a bidding situation, you want to have some sort of hard stop, that's with the agent that you're working with, to say, hey, this is a hard stop we need to make. 70K it is, and you gotta at some point looking into my eyes and say that I cannot say this is really going to be valued at this point, because the consequences are that you need to sort of fill up the appraisal gap, and down the road, if the job market softens, you lose a job, get laid off, then your mortgage payments are up in the air. So I think sustainable home ownership will be an important kind of concept to have. It's not just I close a deal, but do I maintain the deed? And I think that comes down to having that hard stop of, okay, I'm going to stop whatever escalation it is at 55K. This is the most I can afford on top of my parents' money, on the equity I built on the previous home sale, whatever. But hard stop is important. I think broker and agents' guidance is also important to kind of, hey, because I think they're providing information, right? When they say, oh, we have 3 finalists who are 100K over. What do you say, right? I mean, so it's informationally neutral, and I think it's required, right? Because you want to know, you want to make sure that your buyer has that chance to kind of digest it. But at the same time, everybody's conditions different, their circumstances are different, constraints are different. So you want to make sure, okay, this client's not going to go over 60K, and I think many brokers do know this information, so they kind of work in corresponding with each other to make sure that they don't overbid and sort of fall for that overpayment and subsequently defaulting on their mortgage.
Yeah, I mean there was a term that was thrown out there when rates were a little bit higher. It was marry the house, date the rate, which got a lot of pushback,
right?
Because people, I think they misinterpreted that statement, at least from how I use it. It's never going over your means. You never, right, ever want to do that.
Right.
You always want to be in a place where you're comfortable. And, if the rates come down in a couple of years and you can refinance and your payment's going to be lower, awesome. But that needs to be a luxury, not, this needs to happen kind of thing, right? And I think it kind of is the same with, where you go overpaying, because obviously everyone's in a very different situation based on their finances. Some people have extra cash. Some people, don't. So some people have the ability to go higher if they want to. And again, I think it comes down to, you mentioned how long staying in the home. And certainly, yes, things can happen and there's inherent risk, certainly with owning, probably more so now than we've seen in a long, long time. But with that said, the risk of not owning also, because if you're still renting, then we know what the interest rate is on renting. That's 100%.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the difficult sort of decision node, because and then I've also talked to a couple of sort of nonprofit organizations around Rochester, like the Wealth Forward Rochester, and sort of foundations that try to lift the homeownership in different segments of the price levels, and also Black and Hispanic ownership. And I think the idea here is that if you don't, if they never own, there's no equity never built.
Yep.
But then the entry point is so high, so how do you really kind of even enter to do that? And if you enter it, if it's not sustainable to own, then what's the point of, what's the definition of home ownership? A year and a half? I mean, it doesn't make sense to do that. So I think it has to be both, right? And I think that's why rent decision is becoming even more complicated because of the entry point being too high
100%, yeah.
in cities like Rochester. And we've seen in the recent news about the 50-year mortgage.
Yeah, I saw that
and so
recently.
forth. So I
That's just kind of kicking the can down the road.
So I think it's becoming a really complicated decision for a lot of young generations, for first-time home buyers and so forth. Yeah.
Do you know what the age is of the average first-time home buyer?
So I saw that statistics I think on National Association of Realtors on LinkedIn, and I think it was 39 and 40.
40.
Yeah, 40.
40 years old. I mean, that's nuts. So again, let's go back to you mentioned it. There is a proposal out there that maybe a 50-year loan might be a thing versus the traditional 30-year, or obviously 15, 10. You can get into a lot of different things, but 30 is kind of the normal. So you're 90 when you're able to pay off your loan. I mean, it's nuts. How much do you talk about the divide between the haves and the have-nots? Because that's a theme that we bring up on the podcast quite a bit as well. It's ever widening, it feels like, and accelerating quickly.
Yeah, so in our study, we find the socioeconomically vulnerable home buyers, so first home buyers, singles, single parents, and also younger, less educated, Blacks and Hispanics fall for the winner's curse, more likely to fall for the winner's curse, and their sort of winner's curse effects are stronger. And I think this is linked to sort of information in terms of the financial education, plus the experience, just general experience to like, what does it mean to own a home? What does it mean to maintain the home? What does it mean to get a financing, looking at the amortization?
You have to pay for
table.
Home insurance. There's a lot of
right?
things.
So what is closing costs? What does that even mean? So I think there's it is have and have nots, but it's also haves and have nots on the information and experience. So as long as how do we actually sort of narrow that gap? I think is to bring that information, being basically first-time homebuyer education system like the HUD has, or counseling programs in many of the sort of community banks and local banks to help to get a grasp that most people I was also learning in this, right, and still learning in the process to narrow that gap. So it's not just who has more cash, who has less cash, but it's more like the experience. How do we narrow that experience gap? How do we narrow that first generation experience gap and information? And I think that's really important. Yeah.
No, it makes a ton of sense. Again, if you grew up and your parents didn't own a home and they rented, then obviously they're not going to be able to tell you what it's like. So you're kind of learning on the fly. This isn't really an issue necessarily in Rochester as much as I think it's maybe made out to be. But this idea that big companies and conglomerates are coming through and buying up all these single family homes and then flipping them into rentals. There's certainly a fair amount of investors that are out there. But at least in my personal experience, I've never seen an offer come through that was from this like major company. It's always kind of, smaller landlords that might own a handful of properties. But it definitely is an issue, across the nation. How much have you looked into that?
So I haven't really looked at it too much into it, but when I look at my colleagues' studies, I think the main findings so far, the statistics say that it's not as much of people think it is the case. So it is true that certain sort of big companies come and buy the properties, but to have a quantitatively meaningful impact on the house prices and supply, it is not it's not significant or material. That's sort of what I understand it from sort of recent academic studies. Yeah,
which is really interesting because it gets talked about so much. Is it just a catchy headline, basically?
I think locally it must, certain areas, I'm sure there's no dispute that it could be true. But when we're talking about on average, nation 50 states, I think the evidence, in recent academic studies is that they don't really find material or non-trivial quantitative impact on prices or supplies. Now, they're also, we're talking about just sort of big companies where the press might tend to sort of vilify or take a look at that. But
Yeah, it's easy to crap on a billionaire. Right?
yeah, but smaller investors or other, that's a different story too. I think there's also evidence to, evidence that there are a lot of sort of investors coming in, but not the big ones necessarily. Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting too. Again, this is my just experience working with investors, and then having listings where maybe an investor gets involved. They honestly tend to pay the least for a property because they're about numbers. They're not living in the home. It's about margins and how much they can get from it, and that for them. So, yes, if you get into a bidding war with an investor, they may have an advantage, because they're cash or whatever. But typically, someone who actually wants to live there is going to be more aggressive. Again, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment because investors are coming for different reason. It's not their primary residence. At least they're most likely to rent it out or kind of operate that from management perspective. So if you're going against somebody who really loved the house or have enduring love for that, affection for that property, they're probably going to sort of outbid. They'll probably exit the bids. Yeah.
How about kind of the middle ground? Because this idea of house hacking certainly isn't a new thing, but I think it's becoming more and more of a trend. And that is simply you find a multifamily home, maybe it's a 2 unit, maybe it's a 3 unit, and you live in one, and then you rent out the others, and you help basically pay off the mortgage with the rent that's coming in.
Yeah, so I think that's a viable option. So it all depends on sort of the preferences of the households and how they sort of envision kind of doing that. If it's just kind of a couple as opposed to having like 3 kids, will be a different story because you obviously need more space and room.
Sure.
So if they're underutilized space, it's not a bad idea. I think
for like a first-time home buyer, for example, if they're able to swing it.
Yeah, so I think if suppose you're fresh out of college or you get sort of married or have civil union early, and then you want to have that home ownership very early in the stage, I think that's certainly possible to have that. And even if you look at sort of California, if you look at ADUs, you can have sort of the additional sort of detached units in your property depending on the zoning laws. And I think that's probably different in the Monroe County and the New York State, but that's also another way to provide that cash flow or the cushion for potential future sort of a setback on the mortgage payments and so forth. Yeah.
We're trying to get creative any way possible at this point, right?
Yeah.
So I know one of the other big topics that you have, I've done a lot of research in and just have a lot of interest in is AI, which obviously we all have because it's the biggest thing right now. Kind of high level thoughts here on its impact on real estate.
Yes. So I think so. When you think about real estate, it's not really liquid market in a sense that there are a lot of players in. There's escrow account. There's lawyers who need to kind of finalize and verify all the deed documents. There's creditors, so banks, and appraisers and brokers, agents, and then there's home buyers and sellers. So there's a lot of intermediary in between, and I think AI could be used, and I think the direction it's going is to kind of make that intermediary and liquidity part of the real estate market process more efficient, so that we kind of seen that in some of the earlier attempts by the iBuyers, right? So it's more instant, right? So the idea is the convenience, speed, and I think that's going to be what AI will be bringing, so that people are becoming more instantaneous, and information-wise also, more fully disclosed. So you might not have to call the agent every 30 minutes to know, whether this offer goes out. It might be just computerized through the AI. All the sort of looking at that. And also strategies might be provided by the AI to say, hey, the sales comps say this, the bids around this neighborhood were this in the past 6 months, so we advise you to bid this amount. So there might be also optimal bidding strategy in certain heated markets that are advised by AIs, yeah.
Well, we've seen ChatGPT as a plugin with Zillow, so
right.
that was big news. And basically, the plan there is to kind of supercharge their Zestimate, which is the bane of our existence as real estate agents, just because the issue with it, and I'm kind of curious to see how much AI can improve on it, is that AI has not walked through your house, right? Obviously, with AI, you can take photos of it, So maybe that becomes a little bit more, realistic. So in terms of, of pricing it and having a real idea of what your home is actually worth, then I think it certainly can be a valuable tool. And again, no, this is not good for me to say, but I think we will see more of an increase in people trying to sell on their own without real estate agents or brokers involved because they have that information. But I guess the biggest question is still going to be how successful will they be doing so? Because when you dig into it and you look at the numbers, it's a pretty large number. I think it's like 15%, something like that, between working with a broker versus selling on your own. Just because, again, not only is it the pricing and the different strategies, but also, the marketing piece of it as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think seller and buyer have different sort of stake at their sort of home journey. So for seller, they want to sell highest. So can AI do that? Well, maybe not.
Right, yeah.
So I think the intermediary, which is sort of seller's agent, will be important, and sort of seller's ability to negotiate and trying to bring that price up will be even more important now that, sort of do-it-yourself kind of becoming more prevalent in concert with the AI. I think from the buyer's perspective, because they're more largely involved in search process, it's more time-consuming, it's more taxing, and all these visitations that you have to do the open house. I think it will become more welfare improving for the buyer perspective, because even though the photos are not perfect, there's sort of optical imaging process that through AI is improving. And I kind of have this anecdote back in COVID where visits were the masking mandate and sort of social distancing mandate were present. One of my colleagues actually bought a house from New Jersey without visiting Rochester on Zillow, on Zoom. So these can happen. So why not having these optically well-trained AI imaging or video system to really give you the real sort of sense of the house, and it might reduce some hassle costs, because if you're moving from Oklahoma to New York, then hey, these will be useful than flying to Rochester to visit all of the houses in a very compressed amount of time.
Yeah, I've had that experience with some buyers as well, where I was the one that walked through. I had them on Zoom or I had them on FaceTime, and they put a lot of trust in me in that moment, because one thing you can't is smell over Zoom, over photos, right? And just again, like with list price, photos can be a little bit tricky sometimes. I'm sure you've experienced it, where you looked at the listing and wow, these photos really blow you away, and then you walk through the house and it's like, oh.
Yep,
it's a little bit different. So it's going to be definitely fascinating to see. I've been bombarding you with questions. Do you have any questions for me?
So have you fallen for the winner's curse, or you have been you don't think you have overpaid in any sense in any of your transactions, or how has it been, this sort of the Rochester market for you the past 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, it's been, it's a battle, right? I said it up front when I talk to my buyers. I say, get ready for the roller coaster ride, because this could be the first offer, or this could be, the 30th offer. Thankfully, my record's 13. So, okay. But still, it really comes down to the buyer, and it's tailoring what their needs are. And, you brought up escalation clauses. Those have been really important in this market, because it gives you the opportunity to be as competitive as you're able to and comfortable being, while also perhaps not having to pay quite that much. Mm-hmm. And there's certainly been countless instances where we escalated to this number and we got it for, significantly lower, which is always a pleasant surprise. But at least my experience has always been to be very transparent and upfront, and say, again, if you want to go to this number, let's break it down. Here's what the monthly payment's going to be. These are all the costs that are associated with it. Are you comfortable with that? And if so, then okay, let's go. The advice that I always give to my buyers is, what is the number where if you don't win it, you're at peace? And I think that's the best piece of advice that I generally give. Mm-hmm. Because again, there's so much dynamics at play, right? With a different buyer, everyone's situation is different. So it's more so on them to decide, this is our, stopping point. Like, you alluded to it, whether it's 70K over. Again, I would say I would hesitate to make it anything over asking price, just based on the conversation that we had again on, what is asking price, right? Because if we get a house for $200,000 that they listed it at 125. Well, we paid 75 over, or we got it at 200 and it was listed at 200. Well, we got it at asking.
Right.
At the end of the day, it's the same thing, but it's just the framing of it.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think I have a very good sense that you're a good agent. So,
I try, do my best. And I have not, knock on wood, had an experience where, if a client of mine purchased a house and they sold it, if they sold it within a year or two because circumstances change, then yeah, that can happen. But that's really never the plan, for most people. If you're in that house for, 5 years, generally you're going to be in the clear after that. And in the market that we've experienced in Rochester, I've also had it where someone bought a house, they sold it a year later, and they made money on it. So it kind of depends, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it truly is an exceptional market to be honest. Too.
It's not boring. I would say it's not boring. That's for sure. You mentioned this, so I wanted to bring it up just in Rochester news. This is something that buyers always and homeowners kind of freak out about is the assessed value of a property, right? And what your taxes are going to be on the property, specifically in New York, where obviously, compared to the rest of the country, we're much higher. Everyone always kind of assumes, well, if this house is assessed for, half the price of what the asking price is, are these taxes going to double? And my response to that is always no, because what the towns are doing is they're adjusting the tax rate. So they're bringing up the price to whatever it is you paid for or around there as the assessed price, and then they're lowering the tax rate. So the taxes should be, somewhat in line. It's not going to double, basically. And Monroe County just presented their proposed 2026 budget of $1.57 billion. It's a 1.9% increase. And what I find interesting about this is that the full property tax rate is proposed to drop to $5.67 per $1,000 of assessed value, which is a historical low in the county. Over the last 6 years, the rate was cut by $3.12, or 35%.
It's trickling down. It's I think, yeah, because when all the homes are sold in almost above asking price, and there are multiple bids, I mean, then your assessed value is going to go uniformly across the board. So from the county's budget perspective, it's sort of the Christmas early, but also it helps to relieve generally sort of that the rate goes down.
Yeah, because they need what they need for their budget, more or less.
Right. Yeah.
They're trying to match it. I mean, I always tell the story. So I don't actually live in Monroe County. I live in Ontario County. I live in Canandaigua.
Yeah.
We were reassessed, I think it was like 3 years ago,
Okay.
on the house that I own with my wife. And we were initially given a 22% increase in the assessment. And this is where everyone freaks out, right? Because you get the letter in the mail. It's going to go up by this amount. Everyone immediately thinks, well, my taxes are going to jump by that amount. I fought it. You can fight it, by the way. There are grievance days if you want to. You can bring comparable sales.
Yeah.
I help my buyers and sellers all of the time with this stuff where I bring them the sales to them.
Yep.
They can share it with the town or the city, and then you can try to fight to get it down. So I got mine dropped from 22% to 17%.
Oh, good job.
And we ended up paying $200 less a year in taxes.
Okay.
Even with the 17% increase.
It's a great anecdote,
property
right?
value. So kind of interesting there. Yeah. Last thing we always kind of like to touch on, pop culture wise. What are you watching? What are you reading? What are you listening to? What are you into?
Yeah. So recently we've been looking at the latest episodes in the Selling Sunset.
Oh,
so,
you're really into it. You're deep into this.
Some of these, shows that my wife and I watch. So that's gives some perspective because I think it's different location.
Very different. A little more drama.
Yeah. So sometimes we watch that. And yeah, I mean, so recently we haven't really. I mean, with the sort of Bill Nation, we're becoming more. I was New England Patriots and still am a little bit, but
you're converting,
making that conversion.
We won't talk about the Dolphins
game. Yeah, so that's another thing, and we have a little one at home, so
congratulations.
So we're kind of going to different museums. A year and a half. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah, so started to walking a lot, so we're visiting different places like the Play Museum and also for local places. Yeah,
Rochester Museum and Science Center.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it, and certainly would love to have you back at some point as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Corey.